Thank you, families, for joining us for our fifth installation of our junior college seminar. I'll be talking to you all about the state of race-conscious admissions. Unfortunately, during our original conversation back on May 16th, the recording never happened, so I don't have the recording to share. So I am representing this information to you all, and I want to acknowledge that this is happening days after the ruling from the Supreme Court on today's very topic. Today's conversation will be presenting the same information that I presented to families back in May, but I want to acknowledge that we will hold space in the fall to talk about the case, to process the case, and most importantly, to share any news and updates as we've been hearing from colleges and continue to talk about how we will support you and your children throughout this process. I want to give two important acknowledgements before I begin the presentation. First, I want to give a shout out to Dr. Ana Maria Correa, who was not only a thought partner in this presentation, but also a facilitator in the original presentation back in May. So thank you, Dr. Correa, for all of your hard work in putting this together. I also want to give a shout out to my colleagues at the college counseling offices at Loomis Chaffee School in Connecticut and the St. Stephen's and St. Agnes schools at Virginia, who provided really important context that helped frame today's conversation. As we embark on today's presentation, my hope is that we're able to first situate college admissions practices and policies in a historical context to frame an understanding of the system you and your children are about to engage with. This framing will also help to illustrate how colleges evaluate applications and balance the multiple priorities given to them as they sculpt an incoming class. We also hope to provide information about how the current landscape of college admissions may impact how you and your child may experience the college process in the fall. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, we want to affirm how our support to you will be unwavering. We hope to inspire confidence and quell any anxieties that may arise from today's conversation. As Dr. Correa and I were putting this presentation together, there were some few important acknowledgements that we both wanted to raise to families. First, we aren't legal scholars or historians. Dr. Ana Maria Correa, as her role as DEI director and me as director of college counseling, we are bringing in our lived experiences, both from our personal identities, but also from our professional work and our professional practice that help to guide today's conversation. But there's a lot of nuance and history that goes even beyond us. And we can spend hours, if not weeks or months, talking about this one specific element of higher education, but we can't and we won't. So we're coming in this conversation with good intent, but it's important to acknowledge that this is not per se our frame of expertise. We are a part of the discourse both locally and nationally. So a big part of college counseling is not only understanding and helping families kind of understand the world of college admissions and translate that just for folks in our community, but understanding that we are a part of conversations across Brooklyn, across New York City, across the country. So we're really plugged into what's happening and how schools are responding across the board. And that's really important, not only now, but especially moving forward as we make sense of a new reality. We can only present on what we know right now. The future is to be determined. And even though the decision just came out, there is still a lot left to be determined as colleges now make sense of what they need to do and the ways in which they need to comply with the law. So we want to just acknowledge that there's a lot of new information that will be coming our way over the summer, certainly over the fall, and definitely over the course of the year. We're talking about issues that can be controversial, and it's okay to disagree with them, disagree on them. We're all smart, capable, understanding, and caring people, and we don't need to see eye to eye on all things, but we want to present information as we understand that, and more importantly, how we then support you and your child going through this process. And as I mentioned earlier, we're entering the space informed by our own personal and professional histories, which certainly impact how we view things, how we talk about them, and how we engage with this really, really heavy, really tense topic. So to just provide the groundwork for some community agreements, we hope that as you are listening to this presentation, you remain present, you're listening to understand, you're more curious than you are certain. So I'm really acknowledging that many questions may arise and that is okay. ask your questions, send them my way. We will work towards an understanding as a collective. We can have space and hold space for multiple truths. We want to assume positive intent and expect non-closure. So as we go throughout today's conversation, there may be a lot more answers that there are questions. Even after today's presentation or after the summer comes to an end and we're back in the thick of everything, we may not have all the answers we're seeking, but we are working towards finding answers and finding solutions. So as we begin to dive more deeply into the college admissions process, it's important for us to provide some context about the system of higher education that you and your children are about to enter. College and universities, and the admissions process more specifically, are historically exclusive systems. Beginning in 1636 with the creation of Harvard College, universities were established under the guidance of churches, under the spirit of religious tradition, and exclusively for men of elite backgrounds. In their book, Unwelcome Guests, A History of Access to Higher Education, Harold Wesker and Stephen Diner provide a comprehensive history of how race, class, and religion are intertwined with the history of higher education in this country. We could spend hours sharing examples of policies and practices that advanced exclusion, from quotas implemented to restrict the number of Jewish students up until the 1960s, to how policies that were meant to expand access to higher education, like the GI Bill, which have allowed millions of American veterans to go to college, reinforced the racial status quo because Southern states denied Black veterans access to those benefits. Of course, this isn't the history of all colleges and universities. However, what's important to acknowledge is that college admissions, especially at the most coveted institutions, is deeply flawed. It is far from being fair and meritocratic. And yet, as someone who once worked in college admissions, I know that there are admissions leaders trying to make the system better by undoing historical wrongs. There have been important strides to advance access to higher education for all. And in the context of today's conversation, I want to focus further on how recruiting, enrolling, and retaining a diverse and globally representative student body is a priority for many college admissions offices. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is a central tenet to many colleges' admissions strategies. However, there is a conflation that happens between recruitment efforts aimed at bringing in students from all corners of life and affirmative action. I want to spend some time talking further about affirmative action because it is the implications in the incoming, or rather already passed, Supreme Court case that are being decided on or have been decided on as we speak that we'll talk about a little bit later in the discussion. The term affirmative action was first used by President Kennedy's executive order about employment opportunities. It had nothing to do with college admissions, and it wasn't specific to race. It also related to religion and country of origin, and later on, gender and sex. If we think of affirmative action as policies that seek to give people a leg up towards some kind of social goal, like home ownership, employment, or college enrollment, for example, there are a lot of examples all throughout American history of affirmative action at play. We can think about the Homestead Act, which gave people land in the 1860s, the New Deal legislation that provided loans from the Federal Housing Administration in the 1930s, and as I mentioned earlier, the GI Bill that provided a wide range of benefits to all veterans, including covering the cost of college. On paper, these policies appear to be open to all. However, in practice, history has shown that was far from the case. It is important to recognize that these policies and initiatives didn't exist in a vacuum. And so as systemic inequalities continue to persist in America, the ability for all groups to take advantage of these policies have been unequal. In fact, while we conceptualize underrepresented racial and ethnic groups as being the communities that reap the benefits of these programs, the data is clear that the primary beneficiaries of the last 50 years of affirmative action programs, especially in the job market and education, have been white women. Just as the understanding of who reaps the benefits of affirmative action is commonly misunderstood, so is our contemporary understanding of affirmative action in college admissions. It is illegal, again, illegal for colleges and universities to assign extra points or give a boost to students from historically marginalized backgrounds. In the 2003 Gratz versus Bollinger case, the Supreme Court decided that admissions officers could not give extra points to applicants based on their race, which is a practice that the University of Michigan had begun using in 1998. However, in that same year, for the Grutter versus Bollinger case, the Supreme Court stated that the University of Michigan Law School's use of race as one of many factors of admissions was constitutional. In subsequent and similar cases, the verdicts have remained consistent. So it's actually at play, and what was actually decided on when folks don't think about affirmative action in relation to college admissions is a practice known as race conscious admissions, which is a more accurate descriptor of what's happening. It illustrates how admissions officers are conscious of an applicant's race and other elements of a student's background and identity when reading their application, but it is not and cannot be the deciding factor. In fact, racial and ethnic diversity may be one of many factors that an admissions officer has to consider and balance when they're not only reviewing individual applications, but also reshaping and shaping an incoming class. On the micro level, holistic admissions practices encourage admissions offices to explore how all parts of a student's application influence one another. As discussed in the previous junior college seminar, an admissions officer is looking at all aspects of the application and assessing how each piece of the puzzle comes together to form an application. Using a race-conscious admissions approach could be one factor to provide greater context on any one of these pieces. There may be parts of a student's application that illustrates how their racial or ethnic background has influenced parts of their academic journey or upbringing, just like similar information could exist about a student's socioeconomic status, gender, sexuality, religion, etc. Like I mentioned earlier, it is illegal for an admissions officer to give a point to a student who, let's say, identifies as Latinx. But if there's an information in the application that explains that the student is one of a few in their particular school community, or maybe the only one, then that could be useful context to make sense of a student's journey throughout high school. On a more macro level, race and ethnicity is one of many institutional priorities that colleges have as they evaluate applications and shape an incoming first-year class. Other institutional priorities would include other forms of diversity, like geographical diversity, socioeconomic diversity, diversity of academic interests, athletics, donor relations, and legacy admissions could also be other institutional priorities. Most colleges are also dependent on tuition dollars, so a huge institutional priority for many schools is admitting what's they're known as full pay students, or students who do not need to receive any financial aid. Similarly, because of the level of financial or social influence particular families may have, colleges may also give special consideration to donors, trustees, or other high-profile individuals. Less insidiously, colleges have academic needs and want to ensure that they have interested students in each of their academic departments. So that plays a role in how admissions officers may make decisions. While some colleges may say that they are not admitting students into a particular major, it wouldn't be feasible to only admit biologists, right? Or students who are interested in one specific academic area of interest. That wouldn't lead to a particularly dynamic living and learning community, would it? The incoming class should represent the diversity of academic offerings at that particular institution. Meanwhile, the admissions office is one of the most forward-facing and public-facing offices in a college. They must keep in mind the needs and experiences of the public that interact with their schools in a number of ways. So external priorities like rankings or developing pipelines for local communities, or even responding to changes in the job market would influence how admissions deans and directors will make decisions. The work that the admissions office does is reflective of balancing and addressing all of these priorities. These priorities are ever evolving and will vary from institution to institution. From my time in admissions, we were typically made aware of these priorities just days before we began reading applications. However, that didn't mean that if an applicant held a priority of interest, we must automatically admit them. Everything was still reviewed in context and what the student is bringing into the table. So with so many competing priorities to consider, recruiting and retaining a diverse incoming class remains an important tenet for many college admissions offices. Studies show that the learning within a diverse community adds to the educational outcomes and best prepares students for the workforce. Has actually been the basis for the protection of affirmative action in higher education across many challenges and frequently touted as one of the primary benefits of the American college education experience. In recognition of that, admissions offices and universities as a whole make recruiting and retaining a diverse student body a priority. Yes, yet this is the very practice that's under attack. So, which brings us to the present day, or just for a second, imagine that we are before the decision that just came out. So there are two cases that were before the Supreme Court at the moment they're talking about affirmative action, or more precisely, race-conscious admissions. Harvard University is a defendant in one case, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill is the other, and the plaintiff in both cases is Student for Fair Admissions, an organization founded by conservative legal strategist Edward Blum, who has also represented Abigail Fisher in the Fisher versus University of Texas case. Oral arguments began for these cases this past October. So what do these two cases have in common, and why were they lumped together? The fundamental question at heart of both cases is whether the 45-year history of Supreme Court precedents affirming the use of race in admissions, narrowly defined, should be overturned. And how are these cases different? Harvard is a private university and UNC is a public one. But because private universities like Harvard also receive federal funding, they must comply with the law. Students for Fair Admissions claims that Harvard violated the Title VI Act of the Civil Rights Act, which bars any institution that receives federal funding from discriminating based on race. Students for Fair Admissions argues that UNC violates the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, which bars racial discrimination by government entities, which a public university is. Harvard's case in particular involves claims on behalf of Asian and Asian American applicants regarding discrimination. The charge is that based on academic credentials alone, Asian and Asian American students should make up more of the Harvard student body than they currently do. At the moment, Asian Americans represent about 20% of Harvard's undergraduate class. Both Harvard and UNC won their cases in lower courts because the cases came before they came to the Supreme Court. It's unusual that SCOTUS would take on a case this soon after affirming precedent in another case. So the Fisher case against UT Austin was back in 2018. It's also unusual that they took on the UNC case this early because it has not yet gone to the Court of Appeals, which is the typical process. The Supreme Court initially consolidated the cases, then disconsolidated them due to Justice Jackson's having recently served on Harvard's Board of Overseers. Nevertheless, the fact that they're hearing both of these cases now suggests that the court's intent to seriously review 45 years of precedent in these cases. So what's important to know, and what was important to know then, is that depending on what the outcomes were, which we were not able to predict back then, there could have been a couple of different options. First option could have been that Harvard and UNC win, precedent is affirmed, kind of business as usual. But the other options really had to do with how the court would define how race can be considered, if considered at all, if in college admissions moving forward, right? So what we were waiting on is really the language to help college admissions professionals and college counseling professionals understand how they must then shift their applications and how we must then shift students, right? At this juncture, we have a sense of what the language is from the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court did say that students are allowed to talk about their race in their essays and the ways it has impacted them, whether it's negative, positive, or neutral, right? What we're still waiting on, though, is the legality of how colleges can use this information and how they collect this information. So this is likely what's going to be coming out over the summer as colleges work with their legal counsel to make sense of this particular decision, right? So we are waiting in many ways, just like we were waiting back in May, to understand the real implications of this case and the outcomes and how this is going to impact students and families going through the process moving forward. So each state is going to have different interpretations of the law. So there may be differences of how colleges respond to what the Supreme Court shared. There may be differences with how private universities do versus public universities. we are not sure. This is what we're going to be waiting on, right? There may be reimagining of programs that are geared towards inclusion and belonging. There may be challenges, and as of this week, July 5th, there are challenges coming up that are challenging longstanding admissions practices, such as legacy admissions, right? But we may also see challenges to athletic recruitment or even early decision programs, right? They may be eliminated, they may be re-envisioned, but these are things that are starting to bubble up, and I can imagine will continue to bubble up as the months go by. More colleges may be inclined to eliminate standardized testing requirements because of the affirmative action case. But what we have seen is kind of what we've predicted, which is our colleges are remaining vocal in the support of recruiting and retaining a diverse class. What I've been noticing in the past week as colleges, both coming from the admissions offices, but also from the president's offices, is their commitment to making sure that they're recruiting and retaining and supporting a diverse class. So far that seems pretty unwavering on the part of colleges, and we hope that this continues moving forward. So where does this leave us now, right? I want to acknowledge that this is a highly complex case with a very layered history, something that we've just barely scratched the surface on. So reasonable people can disagree on these issues, and that's okay. We can disagree on the concept of holistic admissions. We can disagree on the justification for the use of race as a factor in admissions, on whether multiculturalism is a more compelling argument than equity and justice. We can disagree on whether race should be used at all as a factor of admissions. What's important to us as your college counselors and educators is that you all have a foundation and an understanding of how colleges evaluate applications, why they make the decisions they do, and how all of that is situated in a larger context of social and historical trends. And please know we're here to help you make sense of this, right? We want students to really feel empowered and continue to feel empowered through this process. We want them to understand that they have choice in deciding where to apply and for what reasons to apply. So given where we were back in May, but given where we are right now, I want you to continue to empower your child to exercise that agency, right? If you feel really impacted by this decision and you feel and have questions about how universities will continue to support DEI initiatives or help support your child throughout their journey in their institution, then I want you to consider how much that is central in these colleges, how much that matters to you, and make sure that that is something that is central to your child's college search. For some students, this is important, but this is not the defining factor in their college search, and that's okay. But if you know that these tenets are really important to you and your child, make sure that you are intentional about how you seek that information out, right? Look at their websites, see how they're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but also go above and beyond websites. Talk to people who are there on the college campuses, right? Reach out to professors, reach out to offices in which you think or you know are tasked with diversity, equity, and belonging, and ask them not only how they're responding to the case, but how is it that they're showing up and and centralizing the needs of their students, right? Not only before this case, during this case, but certainly moving forward, right? Be unafraid to ask admissions officers really challenging questions. I want to name that admissions officers are generalists, right? They only know as much as the information that their leaders give them. And some admissions officers are not alums of that particular institution. So there may be questions that you have that they cannot answer, but ask them anyway, right? As we talked about all throughout the spring, we want you to feel good about the institutions you're sending your children to. And if there's questions you have, if there's concerns you have, make sure that you're addressing them and you're seeking out answers. If the admissions office can't answer those questions for you, ask them to point you in the right direction so that way you walk away from that college feeling like you have more information about whether this will be a good fit or not for your child and for your family. We want to make sure that in our counseling, in our programming, in our everyday interaction with students and families, that they feel that you all feel like you can bring your whole selves into this process. We want you and your child to feel valued for who they are. We recognize, and I know that identity matters, and I acknowledge the ways in which identity matters for students, right? And we want them to continue to be confidently who they are, and no decision should ever take that away from your children. And I will make sure, and Lynn and everyone here at Brooklyn Friends will work to make sure that your children feel valued, not only in our school community, but they'll feel valued the next steps beyond Brooklyn Friends. So, no matter the outcome, we have your back. The outcome already came out, unfortunately, and kind of we saw the writing on the walls here, but we want to acknowledge that we want everyone to feel confident with the information that we're presenting, that we have been presenting, and to know and acknowledge that everything that's happening at this juncture with the Supreme Court case, let us as your college counselors figure that out and make sense of it, and then help you in turn support your child through this process. And we will support you as family members throughout all of this as well. So I encourage you to read up on the case to get more context and information, but please know that I am not expecting anyone to be an expert on this, because that is our job, that is our responsibility, right? So this is going to be a continuation of conversations that we've been having before the Supreme Court case. And in fact, I would argue that I've been talking about this particular moment probably since at least 2016, maybe even before then, right? So this isn't new. These challenges to affirmative action aren't new. And we're going to continue to have these conversations, both within our Brooklyn Friends community, within our greater Brooklyn community, greater New York City community, but also acknowledging that both Lynn and I, as your college counselors, are also really connected to national organizations of college counselors in independent schools. So we're going to be speaking and be in community with them, as well as our admissions colleagues, to really keep abreast of evolving policies and practices and give you information that is timely, that is relevant, and then it helps you make sense of how to move forward. I can anticipate that when admissions officers visit us in the fall, they're going to provide us with further insight as to where they're at in their institutions, and any updates to their policies or practices. They'll be communicating that with us and students as well. When we return to the fall for senior college night, I imagine that this will be our community check-in, an opportunity for us to talk about the case, to talk about what happened, and to talk about how we kind of process and move forward, right? So please be out in the lookout for more information, not only about senior college night, but any other community check-ins as it relates to the SCOTUS decision and college counseling. As I mentioned in the site before, we will continue to uplift and affirm every student throughout this process, and that has not and will not change. And importantly, we are and will always be Brooklyn Friends School. Your kids are here for a reason. You chose us for a reason. And we hope that even though we are where we are right now with the Supreme Court case, that you still feel our unwavering support of you and your children and the many identities that they carry in the school. And we will do so with love, with care, and with a ton of compassion. So no matter what the future holds, our core values as a community will be unwavering, and we will continue to support and do what we do best in support of our students and our community. Thank you so much for listening in. This is a lot to unpack. Again, I apologize that the original recording is not available, but I do hope that what is presented today provides you some context about what's been happening over the past couple of months. And most importantly, when we're back in the fall, there will be an opportunity for us to all reconnect and talk about steps moving forward. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful summer, and we'll chat soon.